Welcome everyone to today's book talk. My name is Nadia Ali and I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown, where I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Professor Nazanin Shahrokni. And it's her book that we're going to discuss today, Women in Place, the Politics of Gender Segregation in Iran. Welcome, Nazanin. So we today I'm quite excited because it's the first time that we have synchronous Arabic translation. So there is an interpretation channel, and you can click on Arabic if you like to have the English to Arabic translation. I would like to take the chance to thank Professor Samin Tabatai for helping to organize the event today, and as always, I'm grateful to Barbara Oberkötter. So what's going to happen is I'm going to briefly introduce Nazanin, and then we'll be in conversation for about half an hour, and then we have some time for questions. And I'd like to ask you all to put your questions in the Q&A function if you are joining us via the webinar. If you're joining us via the YouTube channel, you can also put in your questions and someone will be passing them on to us. Okay. So Nazanin Shahrokni is Assistant Professor of Gender and Globalization at the London School of Economics. I think you just recently moved to London, right? Last year. She has a PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley and currently serves on the executive board of the International Sociological Association. Her research interests fall at the intersection of gender politics, feminist geography, and ethnographies of the state in Iran, the Middle East, and beyond, and her articles have appeared in Current Sociology, the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, and the Journal of Middle East Women Studies. Her book, which we'll be discussing today, has been awarded the Latife Yanshater Book Award by the Association for Iranian Studies. So I had the chance to actually read the book over the summer, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, I've been interested in Iran in terms of specifically the gendered aspect and that mobilization. But what is missing is often sort of everyday and in-depth ethnography of life. And I really enjoyed the ethnographic aspect, the thick description, the details, and it was a book that was in many ways very illuminating in terms of the debates and the literature, but it was also really an enjoyable read. So the first question that I have to you is that, when reading, you describe the starting book for your book in terms of your visits to sports stadiums while you were a teenager, while you were in school in Iran. So I'd like to know a little bit more about the journey that led you to actually write the book.
Hello, everyone. And I just need to take this moment to thank you. Thank Professor Al-Ali, Nadia, if I may, and your team, Barbara and Samin, have been really wonderful in setting up this platform. So thank you to all of you. It is true. I mean, you picked up on an interesting point, because the book does stem from experience of growing up in Iran and living, or rather living with paradoxes. I was born in the US, but grew up, studied, and worked in Iran until I was 29 when I left Iran for my doctorate degree. And being in the midst of structures that have shaped me personally, but also women in general, kind of forced me to reflect on this dialectics of freedom and constraint when it came to women. So let me just give you some examples, because you asked for kind of what led me to this journey. I opened the book with a scene from the opening ceremony of the 1995 Student Olympiad, Student Sports Olympiad, which took place in Isfahan, a big city in Iran. And I was there as a member of Shahid Beheshti University's female volleyball team. So yes, believe it or not, there was a time that I had the life outside academia and I was playing volleyball. In any case, the boys were already taken in from the main entrance, and we, the female athletes, were kind of channeled in through the back door from a small alley behind the stadium. This later we understood that this was because They wanted to minimize, the sports officials wanted to minimize the contact between us and male athletes who were already inside. And it also gave the officials a chance to, or the time to check on our appearance to make sure that we are properly veiled and there are no traces of makeup and other things. But what was ironical was that the very officials who were policing our bodies and our behaviors were the officials who had fought hard to, within the masculinist and Islamist domain of sports institutions in Iran, to create this space for women athletes. This was the first time that this kind of joint activity was happening. And so they were invested in keeping the doors open for us, even if these were kind of small back doors. And the paradox is obvious then. These spaces were simultaneously spaces of prescriptions, but spaces of provision. So we were living as Iranian women back then, we were living at the intersection of prohibition and provision, what I call in my book. And in this state of liminality, which I have to say that at times it felt that this is actually normality, that was the reality of our lives day in and day out, I realized that we, that I'm using even now to refer to women, represented a multitude of groups, experiences, and attitudes. So there were female sports officials, there were older team members who were appreciating this opening, this turning point, and then there were us, at least back then, I could consider myself younger members and athletes who were either reluctant to play by the rules, or there were some of us who were actually playing with the rules and bending the rules and making a mockery out of these rules. So throughout the book, it is very much personal. I am reflecting on my personal experience, but the book also represents an, I can say scholarly or academic or an intellectual journey or a political journey, because just as you said, I was dismayed. It represents my dismay at the knowledge production processes in academia about Iranian women, but in general about gender in the Middle East or Muslim majority countries. Because most often when people want to analyze something that happens in Iran in terms of women's issues, they reduce the explanation to Islam as the most important or as the only factor. And I wanted to kind of bring in other actors, and that's why there are many stories about International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization, or even Asian Football Confederation, and how they were also actors who contributed to the shape of, or delineating the contours of women's rights and women's movements. So, and also I couldn't find myself in the literature that was produced about Iranian women outside Iran in particular. So in some ways, yes, the book falls at this intersection of, is very much political and is very much personal.
Yeah, no, I could feel that when reading it. And yeah, like you, of course, I share this, aim to challenge the prevailing frameworks that still exist. I mean, I think that in many contexts, we've gotten better, but probably in relation to Iran, it's still a place where there is this tendency to try to explain everything with respect to the Islamic Revolution, the Islamic regime. But I mean, it's not only that we need to look at other factors, as you do so beautifully in your book, but the other thing that I really enjoyed is that you really challenge also the idea of the Islamic State and the government, that it's not a homogeneous structure or body. So in terms of the role of the state when it comes to gender segregation, we have sort of this idea from the outside, there's Islamic State and sort of strictly enforces gender segregation based on Islamic ideals. And, you challenge that on different levels. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit and reflect on the Iranian state and its changing gender policies. What kind of factors contribute to that? And also what you do very beautifully, look at the sort of historical development. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about that, please.
Thank you, Nadia, for engaging so thoroughly with the book. So yes, again, I mean, you express it very accurately. One of my motivations in writing the book was actually to understand the state. When I started thinking about it, because having grown up in Iran, it was always an enigma for me. What is the state, and why are we sometimes, what are the rules that are kind of shaping the contours of our lives and all of these things. But I had a methodological concern or issue. I needed to figure out where do you locate the state, or how do you make sense of such a, as you said, multifaceted, fragmented entity that is stretched across various scales from the local level all the way to the international level. And in this context, I actually found policies to be a useful entry point. So it was through looking at gender segregation policies actually allowed me to capture the state at its various levels, both at the level of the national, where these policies were national, but also at the municipality level, where these policies are kind of designed, formulated, and discussed, but then also at the level of everyday and local, where these policies are implemented by everyday state agents, the guards in the parks, the police, and so on and so forth. So if I want to use a metaphor, maybe you can kind of liken gender segregation policies as a keyhole through which I was peeking to kind of understand or get a sense of broader changes in Iranian society, but also in the state. If I may share a slide, because I think that will help our wonderful participants here to get a better sense, because in the book I charted transition from one regime of gender segregation to another. And these are characterized by different gender logics, different forms of and patterns of regulation, shifting notions of female subjecthood. So I just want to very quickly show, can you see it? All right, here. This just summarizes basically the whole argument in the book. And I wanted to I argue that in Iran, gender segregated spaces shifted from spaces of exclusion to aimed at restricting women's access to city spaces to spaces of inclusion that allegedly aimed at facilitating women's return to or inclusion in an otherwise male-dominated masculine public space. And as you also see in this table here, the shift from one regime of segregation to the other, I argue that, so I say the first regime was the mode of regulation was prohibition, whereas the second one, mostly starting in the 2000s, was more in terms of provision of women-only spaces. So more women-only colleges, women-only taxis, women-only parks. Women were initially addressed as moral subjects or subjects of Islamic morality, and then eventually they were referred to in official statements as citizens with needs and as citizens who've paid their dues during war and other times, and now they need to be served. But what I also show is, and this is where I capture the multifacetedness of the state. I show that this shift from one mode of regulation, from prohibition, where what I call the disabling of undesired effects, to provision, the enabling of desired effects. This happened through and managed through a discourse of protection, where the state, whether as prohibitor or provider, constantly situates itself as the protector. So in the 1980s, the mode of regulation was prohibition, but the state was situating itself or justifying this prohibition by saying that they are protecting Islamic virtue or women's chastity, for example. Whereas in 2000, you see an increase in the number of times where the state officials actually talk about how they're providing services for women. And for example, on segregated busing, they say this is in order to protect them from male harassment or protect their personal space. So again, it's the state situating itself as the protector here. And as you notice, I'm talking about multiple transitions here, but ultimately with reference to gender segregation policies, the narratives in the book, I think, I'm hoping, they show that how gender segregation policies have transformed from a means of imposing or implementing an Islamic lifestyle, a moralizing tool, so to speak, to a quality of life enhancing measure. And I also show how this shift has happened because the state has had to reconcile diverse imperatives such as technocratic exigencies or pragmatic considerations about the viability of the state, or even the international influences and conditionalities. So I do talk about UN Habitat, for example, and World Bank in the bus chapter, and how they worked with the state to kind of launch bus rapid transits, although they were gender segregated, and also the role of WHO in kind of promoting this discourse of urban health. So yeah, so I wanted basically, by doing that, I wanted to capture both various modes of regulations, various fragments within the Iranian state, but also its interactions with an international community, which is composed of other states, but also kind of transnational institutions such as the UN, and etc.
Yeah. Well, but that is really only one part of your story, isn't it? Because so the changing state, and you put this so clearly now, but then there is actually the women pushing back, complying and pushing back. And I found this so fascinating, you know, the way that women navigate those gendered spaces, gender segregation, you know, the level of complying with those, but then the subtle ways of subverting them. And it is, I mean, the way that I read it, it's, you know, women pushing. That is also one important, or if not the most important factor in forcing the change to rethink and respond to different discourses, like medical discourses, for example. So yeah, if you could tell us a bit more about the way that women actually play, maneuver, navigate, and resist gender segregation in Iran.
Yes, one of the difficulties I had doing my research, and I put the blame there because the book took me a long time to write, all my targets were moving because I wanted to capture kind of the fluidity of not just the state, but also the multiplicity, but also fluidity of women's position, both within the city, but also vis-a-vis the state. So it was very difficult to kind of find the right concepts and the right narratives and the right framework to kind of capture something that's slippery and fluid. So as I said, part of my goal was to kind of capture the multifacetedness of the state and the competition among factions and fractions within the state institutions. But also, why was this important for me? Because these factions and fractions within the state institutions created the opportunity structures that various groups of women, for example, mobilized or used to negotiate, or as you say, also challenge kind of state projects. And so what I argue in the book is that women found themselves in different positions, as I said, in the city and vis-a-vis the state. And therefore I argue that the terms, the binary inclusion, exclusion, whether the Iranian state through gender segregation policies is excluding women, or whether, you know, other states are including women, this binary does not readily convey the complexity and multiplicity of experiences, gratifications, predicaments of being in and out of place. And therefore, in the book, I use the notion of differential exclusion and inclusion. And I argue that, or I show that the very same women might find themselves in different positions on this continuum of inclusion and exclusion, of being or feeling in and out of place in different contexts and moments. And also they may experience prohibition, for example, when they're banned from attending sports stadium, but also provision when they enjoy and welcome or use the recreation facilities in women-only parks. And sometimes these two happen simultaneously. And but going back to kind of this, the variety of strategies that women deployed when they encountered gender segregated spaces, So yes, you're right. I mean, quite often what we hear about or what we focus on is instances of resistance, and there are plenty of them. So I did encounter, and in my interviews and in my research, where women who were refusing to use, for example, women-only parks, although this was kind of the best park in their neighborhood, because they thought that this would normalize segregation, and so they were refusing to use it. At the same time, though, I encountered feminist activists who appropriated gender-segregated spaces and repurposed them. We see in, examples even today, but back then I interviewed the members of a few members of the 1 million signature campaign for the repeal of the discriminatory law. And what I found fascinating was that one of the members was telling me every time they gathered to kind of promote their booklet and collect signatures, they were kind of targeted by the state and by security apparatuses. So they were using the seemingly apolitical and relatively kind of unsupervised spaces of the women-only parks, but also the women-only parks for their activism. That's where they would kind of talk to women, inform them about the discriminatory aspects of the law. They would collect signatures or even recruit new members. But and I think this final kind of category of women that I highlight in my book, for me, this was more important because this shows how the state manages sometimes to consolidate itself and its projects, not through force, but through kind of generating some sort of consent for its project. So I encountered women who saw these spaces as providing some sort of comfort or solutions to their daily problems. For example, many middle-class professional working women that I encountered, they were happily using the gender-segregated bus rapid transit because their rides were faster, cleaner, more comfortable, and as they said, you know, harassment-free. So much so in that sense, what I highlight in the book is that they were becoming active participants in and supporters of this particular state project. But that was not the end of it. They also told me that they've started kind of encouraging their colleagues, their friends, their family members to use these services. And that's where I say, and in that way, they had become kind of the promoters of the state's project of gender segregation. And what's important to note here is that even though they were promoting this particular project, they were not necessarily supporting the state, or they were not regime supporters, so to speak. But what I argue in the book is that it didn't matter, because what is a state if it's not, you know, how does the state consolidate itself if not through its project? And it was kind of this nuanced position. And that's where kind of the interests and the needs of these women overlapped with state interests. And that's kind of the difficult position, I think, for many political activists as well.
Yeah, I can see that. So, you know, I do ethnographic research as well. And so I was trying to imagine your research, and I saw you hanging out in buses and in parks and, you know, obviously trying to speak to many women activists, but also just, you know, ordinary women. And so how did it go? What did you enjoy about your fieldwork? What were some of the challenges? Can you share with us some of, you know, your impressions and experiences of doing fieldwork in Iran?
Yeah, so as I said in the beginning, one of the motivations for me to write this book was that I did want to offer a thick description of women's everyday life. And these words coming from you are actually very heartwarming, so thank you. And as I again said, to do this research, I was in the US, but I had to go back to Iran and to Tehran, where even though I've been away from it for a long time now, I still consider home. So I do have a section in the book where I talk about, the section is called At Home in the Field, because turning your home into your research site had its perils and perils. So obviously, because I grew up in Iran, I was fluent in Farsi, but also body language, because our bodies are also socialized. So I could easily carry myself in the streets of Tehran without being noticed as a researcher who's speaking, and who's Tehran was like, the Tehran streets were familiar stages for me. In many cases, the connections that I developed with the stranger on the bus made them kind of, and it's very common in Iranian culture anyway, but it made them kind of assign fictive roles to me. So they would, fictive kin roles to me. So they would call me, you know, my daughter, Dokhtaram, by the end of the bus ride. So it was, I had many mothers during my bus rides. And also because one thing that I did not mention, when I was in Iran for 6 or 7 years, I worked with Zanan magazine, which was a feminist monthly magazine that was eventually shut down by the government, only to reappear with a different name later on. So that kind of network also really helped me, both in terms of social support, but also reaching out to setting up interviews, but also reaching out to state officials. But because you highlighted the bus rides, I wanted to say that my fieldwork basically entailed discovering several layers of my home city. And I spent endless hours with observing Tehranis and talking to them and monitoring their rhythms, body language, gestures, and the way they occupied and navigated space. So it entailed visiting women-only parks, using the multiple facilities to get kind of a visceral sense, stepping into women's gathering in different corners of the park. And during these visits, I heard many stories of, you know, huge struggles, small pleasures, confusions. I heard a lot about baby poops and unruly teenagers. So there was so much desire to talk and to share, and I appreciated that. And my visits to the stadiums were also exciting. Initially, I was able to capture, these were volleyball matches, which were, back then we were allowed, or Iranian women were allowed to watch volleyball matches. So I was able to capture and feel the excitement of young female fans. And in one occasion, which was very interesting, maybe it's also interesting for the participants who are here, was that in outside House of Volleyball, an important volleyball match was happening, and outside there was a huge line of girls. The girls had lined up with flowers and gifts because the physical trainer of one of the teams was Mohammad Reza Golzar. For the audience who are here, they know what I'm talking about. He's a very famous actor and loved by many younger kind of generation women. So, but he was also the physical trainer of one of the teams. So, you know, these moments that are not tangible or visible when you're outside and you don't see them. And obviously, as you said, the most joyful part of my research was the bus rides, because that's where women from different walks of life, but also different backgrounds would come together. So I always tell everyone that, you know, the domestic worker, the hairdresser, housewives, university students, the high school girl, all of these people who appear in my narratives, they're the ones who actually helped me write the book. And I sometimes actually regretted when the bus ride ended, that I have to say goodbye to many of these people. And there were so many difficulties as well. I think the difficulties of doing research in Iran are more familiar for or people talk about it a lot. I still say I'm Iranian, but anyway, I was read, and I am an Iranian American. So I was also read as such. And being an Iranian American feminist who had gone to Iran to do research on women's issues, it had its complications. In the political sense, when I was interviewing state officials, there were moments where the suspicious gaze would turn towards me. Why are you asking these questions? And why would a US university even fund you to come and do this research? We know you're coming here with an agenda. So it was, it took a lot of energy to kind of navigate that kind of hostile, sometimes terrain. But then there were also moments where, moving away from the state officials in the parks, I realized, because I was read as an Iranian American progressive, liberal, whatever, feminist, at least by my interviewees, some of them, there was this discomfort in expressing comfort about, in expressing their comfort about using these segregated spaces. So I had interviewees who were constantly telling me, yes, you know, I mean, the bus rides are wonderful, the parks are wonderful, but then I think in their mind, they were kind of calculating, how is Nazanin reading us? She thinks of us now as a backward woman who's enjoying segregated spaces. So they would immediately give me a counter example to show that they're not backward. And so these were kind of the moments that sometimes it was hard, because I realized that I myself am being read through certain tropes that I have had no role in shaping them, and it was difficult to navigate that as well. And then, you know, women's issues are securitized. I don't want to downplay the importance of it, but it didn't help that my field work happened during the 2009, when the Green Revolution, Green Movement was happening. And also many, and still are, many dual citizens were arrested. Some of them were doing research in Iran. So there was a lot going on, a lot of pleasures, but also a lot of uncertainties and insecurities.
Yeah. Yeah,
Sorry, I
actually,
can talk about my book for
no,
hours. When you get
yeah,
my
actually, I'd like to
question.
follow up on this, but before doing that, I'd like to invite the audience to post their questions in the Q&A function in the webinar, or also you can do that via YouTube. So, you know, following up on what you were just saying, I can also imagine then, okay, you were facing these specific challenges, being seen as an Iranian American, but then coming back here, I assume there were also challenges, you know, especially, you know, in the current context. And so, yeah, I guess I have a sort of two-part question. One is about the tensions between the West and particularly the US and Iran. How might they have impacted gender policies within Iran? And then secondly, given this context of the tensions between Iran and the US, how has it been for you coming back here and, you know, writing about gender segregation in Iran? Yes.
Difficult question. But let me make it easier by first not tackling the tension part, but actually saying that while this is a very important question, and I'm glad you asked it, but I also want to highlight that we tend to think about Iran and the West and Iran and the US relationship always in terms of tensions and animosity. But one thing that was the one thing that I think is important is that Iran has been interacting with the West, including the US, in a multitude of ways, including cooperating and embracing agendas and policies, including the not so very good neoliberal policies. So that's why I said my book also kind of touches on in different chapters about this collaboration with some of the international organizations, and how this collaboration has given rise not only to negative consequences like the neoliberal logics and the production of new forms of marginality, but also to discourses and tools for transformation that have in some cases ended the association of women with and confinement to the home, for example, and has opened up, again, maybe back doors, but still doors. And some of these discourses that have that are kind of global, Western produced, they have kind of posit women as clients and customers. And so there is a market logic now, even in the gender segregation, that is the product of kind of embracing some of these Western and global discourses. But when it comes to the tensions, particularly with the US, I have to say that looking from the outside of Iran, it is difficult because women's issues are often weaponized, particularly by hawks in the US policy circles. And we've seen how women's rights become the fig leaf of calls for punitive measures that do not necessarily, or not at all actually, improve the position of women. In fact, I'm engaged in another kind of body of research where we are showing how the very policies that are adopted by some of the US policy circles, in particular economic sanctions, US-backed economic sanctions, how they are actually undermining the civil society and the position of women within both civil society, at the workplace, and at home. Yeah, so the tension is actually, it's very difficult. For me, the most difficult part, maybe I can end with this, was choosing a topic, and still, whenever I'm invited to give talks on women's issues in Iran or write a new project, it's very difficult because I'm playing in two different political fields. When I'm inside Iran, my agenda, my priorities, when I was there and I was writing as a journalist or a feminist activist, my agenda and my priorities were different than now that I'm outside of Iran, in the US in one way and now in the UK in a different way. And so I have to constantly reorient myself, because I do write under this constant pressure of which group is going to kind of use this argument, or which discourse is my argument going to feed into. And so it becomes a very kind of difficult terrain to navigate sometimes.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. I mean, I experienced sort of similar tensions and dilemmas with respect to Iraq. And I guess
Right.
knowing what I know about the Iranian diaspora, you're also facing a very, very polarized diaspora there. So it's not that, it's a kind of inside outside, but it's much more complex. And so
Sure.
I can imagine that this is a very difficult terrain. And I don't envy you, but I'm sure you're doing a great job. I'm now going to turn to the audience. We have a few questions. I'm going to take two, one by Tiba Bonyat, who's saying, thank you so much for this great discussion. How would you suggest to study gender issues in Iran while not being trapped in the Islamic lens of analysis, and in the meantime, considering Islam as a component? And then secondly, a question by Saida Masood, who's asking, what gender dynamics did you notice in the Iranian left socialist groups?
Very good questions, difficult ones. So I think for the first one, I'm also going to advertise my book, read my book. I'm hoping that I've tried to do that. So I'm not overlooking, or I'm not dismissing Islam as a factor in shaping the policies. The very basis of gender segregation framework comes from some sort of reading of Islamic doctrines. So, but what is important, what is I think really important, is that exactly that, looking at Islam as a factor, or as an entity that itself, the reading of it is also mediated through the pragmatics of the state, through the connections of the state with the international community. We've seen over the past 40 years in Iran how there have been different interpretations of Islam, and how these different interpretations, how they've shaped, or they've found their ways into policies in different ways. So that's one thing. I think it's also very important for all of us who are studying. I think in general, I appreciate it when people who are studying the state, they actually don't state in a vacuum, or they don't suffer. Their work doesn't suffer from this kind of. The state is not bound to the national borders. That's what I mean. That in order to capture the fragments of it and its multifacetedness, we need to also look at how the state is engaging both downward with its citizens at the local level, but also upward and outside. It is important to kind of bring in these multiple actors into our research. The second question about the left. I'm not well versed to answer that question, but the only reason I say that is that I think this requires research. I haven't positioned myself in a place where I can speak for the left in Iran. But one thing that I know, at least encountering many of the leftist activists here in the US, I still think I'm in the US, outside of Iran, is that there is this tension between, are we going to criticize imperialism and US intervention and focus on the West as, as the root of all evil in Iran? Or on the other side, it's then, how do we situate ourselves vis-a-vis the Iranian state? How do we talk about the human rights violation in Iran without feeding into the imperialist projects? So I think that's the tension that many of the leftist activists that I've talked with are grappling with. And I'm really happy that I see kind of new waves of activists and scholars who are kind of trying to bring these two aspects together, that it's actually the simultaneous study of what the Iranian state is doing and how, for example, some of the US policies are contributing to the production of some forms of marginality in Iran. So it's this simultaneous study of both components that are very important.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read out a comment and then have some more questions. Sure. The comment is by Fatima Aziz Muhammadi, who says, I just wanted to express my experience as a woman who worked in the presidential administration office. I was the only legal advisor who worked in a muscular environment, so they allocated a sharing room to me with other women administrative staff, while other experts had their own special room as legal advisors. I felt isolated and frustrated. Finally, I wrote my resignation after 2 years. So that's an experience. Maybe you want to reflect on this. But now a question from our colleague, Samin Tabatai. One question being, the case studies you analyzed perfectly render the state-mandated gender segregation that is specific to Iran. Do you see selecting a set of other case studies that are more universal in terms of gender segregation, like, for example, women prisons? Would they have broadened the applicability of your research? And then a second question, Shiite clerical establishment has been quite adept in embracing new global, social, and technological phenomena, for example, transsexuality. Why do you think they were not meeting women's request for entrance to stadiums earlier? After all, during the past decades, the Iranian government has mastered various tactics of spatial configuration based on gender segregation. In your view, why gender segregation within football stadiums was deferred for so long?
Okay. Yes, I just want to comment on the comment very quickly. Farishta, I'm forgetting her last name now. Yes, I'm glad she's mentioning that, and that is actually the problem. So in that opening scene, in the opening of my book, where I talk about that scene of the opening ceremony of the Sports Olympiad, one of the things that I wanted to highlight was exactly that many of the officials, female officials, that for a very long time some of us, not everybody, considered as the villains of the story. They were the ones who were policing us, who were taking the happiness away during a sports Olympiad. But it took me a while, maybe also working for Zanan magazine, to realize that many of these women themselves were caught up in kind of a web of masculinist and Islamist kind of institutions. So as Farishta was saying, I think it's just more evidence to not just how these institutions are masculinist, but also how sometimes there's no space for women, and how it makes it difficult to be the only woman who's kind of represented or present in an institution. So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that, and acknowledge all the kind of struggles and tensions that also go on between the female and the male state officials within these institutions as well. In terms of the question about why didn't I look at women prison, and in order to kind of broaden the applicability of my research, I have to say that when I started designing my research, my concern, maybe I did not have this professional concern or even intellectual concern of writing a book that's applicable to many of. I wanted to understand what's happening with women in Iran, and what is this entity that we call the Iranian state. So that's why maybe I wasn't, maybe if I were kind of thinking about the applicability, I would have kind of chosen other topics, but I'll get back to that. And that's why I really like this question. The reason I didn't choose women prison, or even mosques or beaches, which are all of them are gender segregated, was because I wanted to focus on public spaces that are, or at least are supposed to be, accessible to women of all backgrounds and all kind of ages and all walks of life, basically. So this is why I didn't focus on some of these kind of very particular women-only spaces, including women prison. But for my next project, I actually decided to do what I think it was Samin who asked the question, is indicating, and I appreciate that. As I finished the book, I realized that, and whenever I present my work, I realize that many of these discussions suffer from the fact that many of the audience take Iran to be an exceptional case, or gender segregation to be kind of limited within the boundaries of the Middle East or Muslim majority countries. And so I wanted to kind of, for my next project, I'm following instances or initiatives of gender segregation. They're not called that outside the Middle East. That goes outside the Muslim context or the Middle East. So I'm focusing on women-only taxis across the globe. It's a multinational, multi-country project. And whereas in my book, I zoom in on one country, Iran, to highlight the diversity across or the diverse dynamics across different gender segregated spaces. For the next project, I'm planning to do just what Samin is suggesting, to kind of broaden the applicability of my argument and show how women-only taxi initiatives are being used, but are being articulated differently in different contexts. And the majority of my cases are not in Muslim majority countries.
So I have two questions here, one by Asma Abdi. Your argument about the shift of discourse from prohibition to provision is making me think whether we can talk about some sort of authoritarianism upgrading itself, because at the end of the day, the state is positioning itself as the ultimate regulator of the space in terms of gender segregation. Second question by Sahar Maranlou. Thanks for your great presentation. I have not read the book yet, but looking forward to reading it. From an empowerment perspective, would you think gender segregation in public transport would address mobility barriers, knowing that it's not a solution to the problem of sexual harassment?
Great, so thank you. The first question, sometimes I avoid falling into the traps of labels. So you can call it authoritarianism upgraded. I actually in my book also talk about how this also comes out of the work I did with a colleague of mine, and we kind of came up with this concept of patriarchal accommodation. So we refer to many of these policies that, for example, Iranian state adopts as patriarchal accommodation, and our argument was they're patriarchal because they still contribute to to the consolidation of gender difference and gender domination, but they're accommodations because they are kind of constantly adapting to and adopting new kind of norms of femininity and masculinity. So in the book, I also argue that, you know, yes, the bus space expanded in the beginning. I have a slide. Do we have time? Can I show the slide?
Yes, it's fine.
I just want to show the slide. That's me trying to draw, basically summarize my chapter, my bus chapter, into a diagram. So excuse that it looks very childish, but yes. So what I argue in the bus chapter, or what I show, is that, okay, before the revolution, the bus space was mixed, but anyway, the buses were not used, or the bus system was not widely spread across the city. The revolution happens 1980s, there is a masculine public space, and then what I call gender segregation phase one, or regime one, was carried out under Islamic terms, and women were kind of addressed as moral subjects. So as you see here, what I show is that women occupied, the bus space was segregated, and the 1/3 of the back of the bus was given to women. And the driver was also a man. And I'm sorry for using this kind of gender binary colors of blue and pink or whatever, but anyway, I needed to make a point here. 1990s, I talk about all these transformations that happened. These kind of the World Bank structural adjustment policies were implemented, women's education, women's entrance into university increased. A lot of kind of demographic shifts happened. So I call that decade a decade of kind of increasing feminization of public space. What happened was that in response to that, so the person who asked the question is right. It is a state responding to some of the changes. And Nadia, in the beginning, you mentioned that it is interesting how women also created this push from the bottom, from below. And so in response to that, the state didn't drop its gender segregation policies, rather it modified it. How did it do that? It expanded it. So many people usually talk that, you know, women won, women put pressure and the state backed up. And that's why women's access to public space is expanding. What I highlight in the book, I think I like to work with counterintuitive moments, is that women's access to public spaces expanded as the state's reach also expanded and as the state further consolidated itself. So by the year 2000 something, 2004 or 5, what we see is that the bus spaces that were gender segregated, the spaces was now equally divided. So half of the bus was male, half of the bus for men, for half of the bus for women. On top of that, during rush hours, at least for a year, there were women-only buses with women bus drivers. They were eventually removed from the scene, but it was just interesting that, and that's what I call provision through expanding gender segregation. So yes, you can call this authoritarianism upgraded. It is also, I wanted also to show that ultimately, because the state is the result of or was established after a popular revolution, it draws its legitimacy from, you know, maybe some sort of Islamic framework, but it's also dependent on constantly renewing or addressing legitimation crisis. So it needs to constantly address demands. So that's where I'm not sure how to put that into context. Sahar's question, thank you very much. Yes, I mean, the notion of empowerment is complicated because I did encounter in my research some women who were coming from, who were residing in working class, poor neighborhoods of Tehran. They were extremely observant. And they were actually telling me that had it not been for segregated buses, so they were even avoiding using private taxis because that would still put them with a male driver inside a closed space. So they were the ones who were telling me that they actually appreciated the bus segregation, and it provides them with some level of comfort and security, or even it was actually more comfortable in terms of habitus because they're not used to being mixed or mingling with men. So the bus space was kind of fitting them. And so they had become mobile. This woman that I talked to, for those who know Iran, she was living in Azerbaijan, which is a street, not the province, a neighborhood in south of Tehran, southwest, I think. And her daughter was living in Vanak, which is a north center, but it's to the north, and it's more kind of affluent neighborhood. And she was several times during the week, she was getting on the bus to come and do childcare for her daughter, who was a bank clerk. So it is empowerment in the sense that mobility is expanding, it's becoming more comfortable, women become more mobile. But the reason I say that, why was she doing that? It was because her daughter had to work, the salary was not enough. So now she had to come and do the unpaid work of caring for her daughters, her grandchildren. So in that sense, it is another form of, I mean, she's doing it for her daughter out of love, but exploitation or oppression maybe. Yeah, but I did encounter many women, not only religious women, I have to say, and actually that's one of the points that I make in the book as well, that even at the beginning, the first decade of the revolution, there were many secular women who, or the professional women that I mentioned, they were not using the bus because they were religious. They were using it because now the state officials are framing them as, you know, more comfortable with air conditioning, cleaner bus rides. So they were using it because it was just more convenient. And in that sense, yes, it had also expanded their mobility.
Great. So we are slowly but surely running out of time. I'm going to read out the last 3 questions here, and then you'll have a few minutes to answer them, and maybe you can pick and choose. But I think it's important to read them out. The first one is by Zainab Saifpour, who is saying, hello, Nazanin, thanks for a great presentation. I'm Iranian and have experienced all these unpleasant segregations. As Iranians, we prefer to blame the government for these drawbacks, but I think even if our regime changes tomorrow, people will follow the same way of life. What do you think about that? I think it comes from Islamic teachings. Such women need support and men can't control themselves, which I guess need to be critically discussed. Did you consider that in your book? Another question by Ismail Musa, who says, how do you overcome the religious narrative of the role of women and the frontiers outlined by religious leaders to create a specific societal order. Yes, the barriers outlined by religious leaders to create a specific societal order. And then a final question from Samin. Would you be able to elaborate on the location of all women parks in urban space? Were you able to find a pattern in the ways in which the municipality chose the location of these parks? That's a very specific question. And we literally have 5 minutes. So if you could manage to answer those in 5 minutes, that would be brilliant.
Okay, I'm sorry to say I have to select. So
Yes.
I picked the last one and the other thing that stayed in my mind. So the first one about, if the regime falls tomorrow in Iran, what will happen to gender segregation or similar policies? Obviously, I don't talk about what has not happened, but I do look at gender segregation policies historically. And I do show that actually and it's a very Foucauldian approach, that what the state kind of what was turned into a state project was a social project. So gender segregation was socially upheld by people. It was a social project and was upheld by people even in the previous regime. So, but what I say is that the previous regime, the Pahlavi regime, what they did was they turned desegregation into a state project, whereas in the under the Islamic Republic, gender segregation became a state project. So yes, it is deeply rooted in some kind of social norms and rule. And you see that what I also noticed, or actually I have to say, acknowledge that I had a foreign friend who was visiting me when I was in Iran, and she noticed that even in my household, when get-togethers happen, automatically men go to one side and women go to another side. They would mingle in other, in other moments, but there is this tendency of separation. And sometimes one thing that I think my work also suffers from, maybe I can close this conversation by a critique of my own work, is that most of the work that comes out of Iran or is about Iran focuses on big towns, and in particular Tehran. So the issue is completely different when we move to provincial towns, but also in villages and rural areas. And I think there, what one of the person who asked the question is referring to is more vivid and tangible. And I'm just going to end, maybe, if I may, just showing the slide about the location of the parks. That's because I have it here. This is actually the Minister of Health. At some point when they were promoting, finally, after 20 years, women's outdoor exercise, she joined morning exercises with the women in the park. So this is what I wanted to show you in response to Samin's question. So let me just bring it here. So when I was doing study, these dots represent the first women-only parks in Tehran. So the municipalities stated that they had three criteria in mind when they were choosing these spots. One was visual security, and that's why I have the first picture at the top, because most of these parks are built on a hill. And that's why I call them Wuthering Heights, because if they're on the hill, they're not visible, and they benefit from some sort of visual security. Otherwise, they're covered around them. It's a green iron sheet. The second one was accessibility. So these parks are usually around public transportation or a public transportation stop or station is nearby. And the third one was they specifically mentioned social justice. So they didn't want this service to be something that's provided only to the affluent north, but kind of scattered evenly across the town. And you might be interested to know that some of these parks are actually the best parks in the neighborhood that have been assigned to women. And in one occasion, at least for the Mother's Paradise in Abbasabad, there was a petition by the men of the neighborhood complaining that the best park in the neighborhood has been taken away from them and has been allocated mainly to women. Yeah, so.
Great, well, thanks so much. I mean, I am hoping that sooner rather than later, I will be able to see those parks. And I hope that's in a context where the tensions between, especially the US and Iran will ameliorate, that we'll have, better context in which to have exchanges, both academic and activist exchanges. I want to thank you for very, very interesting, not just book, but also conversation. Just wonderful.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank the audience for your questions. And we have recorded this event, so we'll make it available for people so you can show it to your friends and colleagues or students. And I'd also like to thank the interpreter. And yeah, wish you all the best.